The popular historical narrative of the Second World War is inextricably linked to the image of the tank. The mechanized behemoths tearing across the steppes of Russia, the deserts of North Africa, and the fields of France dominate the visual legacy of the conflict. The concept of blitzkrieg, built upon the rapid penetration of armored spearheads, has cemented the tank in the public consciousness as the ultimate arbiter of battlefield supremacy. However, a meticulous examination of casualty statistics, medical records, and the grim reality of infantry combat reveals a starkly different truth. The weapon responsible for the greatest share of battlefield casualties during the Second World War was not the imposing heavily armored tank, nor was it the machine gun or the strategic bomber. It was a simple steel tube mounted on a metal baseplate, a weapon so technologically rudimentary that its basic design had barely evolved since the trenches of the First World War. The mortar, a highly portable indirect fire weapon system, killed and maimed more soldiers across all theaters of the conflict than any other implement of war. To understand why this seemingly primitive weapon completely outpaced the modern battle tank in sheer lethal efficiency, one must entirely discard the cinematic view of warfare and delve into the cold, hard mechanics of ballistics, topography, and military logistics. The fundamental advantage of the mortar lies in the geometry of its trajectory. A tank relies on direct fire, meaning the gunner must have a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the target. The high-velocity shells fired by tank guns travel in a relatively flat trajectory. If an enemy infantryman simply drops into a shallow trench, hides behind a small hill, or takes cover behind a thick stone wall, the tank gun becomes largely ineffective. The armor-piercing rounds are designed to penetrate steel, not to clear out a ravine, and the high-explosive rounds fired from a flat trajectory tend to bury themselves into the nearest obstacle, directing the blast energy harmlessly into the earth. The mortar operates on the entirely opposite principle of indirect fire. It utilizes a high-angle plunging trajectory, firing its projectile almost vertically into the air, allowing it to arc over mountains, forests, buildings, and defensive fortifications. The shell reaches the apex of its parabolic flight and then plummets straight down upon the target. There is no defilade from a mortar. A soldier hiding in a deep trench or huddled behind the reverse slope of a ridge is completely protected from direct rifle or tank fire, but is entirely exposed to the vertical rain of a mortar barrage. This high-angle capability meant that the mortar could reach into the very spaces where infantrymen desperately sought refuge, completely neutralizing the natural cover and concealment that soldiers rely upon to survive. The physical mechanics of the mortar weapon system dictated its overwhelming presence on the battlefield. A medium tank of the era like the American M4 Sherman or the German Panzer IV weighed roughly 30 tons. It required a massive logistical tail, millions of gallons of aviation-grade fuel, specialized maintenance crews, heavy transport vehicles, and extensive bridge infrastructure just to reach the front lines. A tank is a strategic asset allocated at the battalion or division level, and its presence on a specific battlefield was often the result of complex operational planning. In contrast, the standard infantry mortar, such as the American 81mm M1 or the German 8cm Granatwerfer 34, was a masterpiece of lethal portability. The entire weapon system consisted of three primary components: the smoothbore steel tube, the bipod mount, and the heavy metal baseplate. Disassembled, the mortar could be carried by a three-man crew across any terrain that an infantryman could traverse. They required no fuel, no roads, and no bridges. Mortar squads marched alongside the riflemen, hacking through the dense jungles of the Pacific, scaling the sheer cliffs of the Italian Apennines, and wading through the frozen mud of the Russian steppes. They were organic to the infantry companies, meaning that every single infantry unit moving into combat carried their own highly responsive artillery with them. The sheer numerical disparity is staggering. While armies fielded thousands of tanks, they fielded hundreds of thousands of mortars. This absolute saturation of the battlefield meant that an infantryman was vastly more likely to encounter an enemy mortar barrage than an enemy tank. The lethality of the mortar is further compounded by the physics of its ammunition and its astonishing rate of fire. A tank crew operating inside a cramped steel turret must manually extract a heavy shell from the ammunition rack, wrestle it into the breech, close the breech block, acquire the target through a narrow optic, and fire. A highly trained tank crew might manage 10 to 15 rounds a minute under ideal conditions, but usually far less when buttoned up under fire. A mortar by design is incredibly fast. The loader simply drops the teardrop-shaped fin-stabilized shell down the muzzle of the smoothbore tube. Gravity pulls the shell down until the primer in the base of the ammunition strikes a fixed firing pin at the bottom of the tube, instantly igniting the propellant charge and launching the projectile into the sky. A proficient mortar crew operating without the mechanical restrictions of a breech block could easily drop 20 to 30 rounds a minute. A single platoon of 381mm mortars could saturate a target area with nearly 100 high-explosive shells in 60 seconds. The suddenness and volume of this fire were devastating. By the time the first shell impacted and detonated, the mortar crew had already dropped 3 or 4 more shells into the tube, ensuring that the target area was blanketed in overlapping blast waves before the enemy infantry could even react or seek hard cover. The design of the mortar shell itself was perfectly optimized for the destruction of soft targets, namely unprotected human flesh. Tank shells required thick steel casings to survive the extreme pressures of the rifled barrel and to penetrate enemy armor. This thick casing limited the amount of high-explosive filler the shell could carry and often resulted in the casing splitting into a few large heavy fragments upon detonation. Mortar shells fired from a smoothbore tube at much lower pressures did not require this structural integrity. The casing of a mortar shell was made of relatively thin cast iron meticulously scored or forged to shatter into thousands of small razor-sharp fragments upon detonation. Furthermore, because the shell arrived from a vertical angle, it did not bury itself deeply into the ground before exploding. The point-detonating fuse on the nose of the shell triggered the main charge the millisecond it touched the earth or the branches of a tree. The resulting explosion created a perfectly circular matrix of high-velocity shrapnel radiating outward parallel to the ground, completely scything down anyone caught within the lethal radius. The fragmentation pattern of a mortar was inherently vastly more efficient at causing human casualties than the blast pattern of a standard artillery or tank shell. The topography of the major theaters of the Second World War heavily favored the employment of mortars while severely restricting the effectiveness of armored vehicles. Consider the Italian campaign, characterized by the brutal grinding battles along the Gustav and Gothic lines. The terrain consisted of jagged mountain peaks, deep narrow valleys, and steep rocky ridges. Tanks were entirely confined to the few narrow twisting roads at the bottom of the valleys, where they were easily destroyed by hidden anti-tank guns or mines. They could not elevate their guns high enough to engage the German positions on the peaks, nor could they climb the sheer slopes. The infantry, however, had to assault these mountains, and they relied entirely on their mortars. The German defenders, utilizing reverse slope defenses, dug in on the back sides of the mountains, rendering themselves completely invisible to Allied direct fire weapons. But they could not hide from the plunging fire of the Allied 81mm and 4.2-inch chemical mortars. The mountains of Italy became an endless artillery duel between hidden mortar pits, lobbing thousands of tons of high explosives back and forth over the rocky peaks, inflicting horrific casualties on the infantry huddled in the freezing mud. The environment rendered the tank irrelevant and elevated the mortar to the supreme weapon of the campaign. A similar dynamic played out in the claustrophobic confines of the Normandy bocage. Following the D-Day landings, the Allied armies found themselves trapped in a dense network of ancient hedgerows, massive earthen embankments topped with thick, impenetrable vegetation. A tank attempting to break through a hedgerow would be forced to ride up over the bank, exposing its thinly armored underbelly to waiting German Panzerfausts and anti-tank guns. The hedgerows divided the landscape into thousands of tiny isolated fields, completely eliminating the long-range line of sight required for effective tank gunnery. The combat devolved into bloody close-quarters infantry engagements where the mortar reigned supreme. German mortar observers hidden in the thick canopy of the hedgerows would call down devastating barrages on the American infantry trapped in the sunken lanes. The high-angle fire of the mortar allowed the Germans to drop shells perfectly over the hedgerows, landing them squarely among the advancing platoons. The American forces quickly adopted the same tactics, heavily relying on their own 60mm and 81mm mortars to blast the German defenders out of the dense brush before the infantry attempted to cross the open fields. In the bocage, tanks were floating coffins vulnerable to ambush at every turn, but the mortar was the absolute master of the enclosed battlefield. The psychological terror inflicted by the mortar cannot be quantified by mere statistics, but it played a massive role in the combat effectiveness of the infantry. A tank is a profoundly loud machine. The roar of its engine, the clanking of its steel tracks, and the immense muzzle blast of its main gun announce its presence long before it arrives. An infantryman has time to hear the tank process the threat and attempt to hide or maneuver. An incoming artillery shell from a distant howitzer creates a distinct, terrifying shriek as it tears through the air, giving soldiers a brief, agonizing moment to dive into their foxholes. The mortar, however, is notoriously silent. Because the projectile is fired at a relatively low velocity and relies on a high parabolic arc, it does not break the sound barrier. The firing signature of the weapon, a hollow metallic thunk, is often swallowed by the ambient noise of the battlefield. The shell falls from the sky completely silently until the very last second, when it produces a brief characteristic rustling or whispering sound through the air just before detonation. For the infantryman, the explosion is instantaneous and entirely without warning. A quiet holding position could be transformed into a slaughterhouse in the blink of an eye. This constant unseen threat, the knowledge that sudden violent death could drop directly from the sky at any moment without a sound, induced a level of psychological strain and combat fatigue that shattered the minds of thousands of soldiers. Men learned to fear the silent falling of the mortar far more than the loud mechanical advance of the tank. The ultimate expression of the mortar's lethal potential occurred in heavily forested environments such as the Hurtgen forest on the German border. Here the American army engaged in one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the war, fighting through a dense, dark expanse of towering pine trees. Tanks were virtually useless, restricted to the few muddy logging trails where they bogged down or struck mines. The forest was an infantryman's nightmare, and the German army turned it into a meat grinder through the systematic application of mortar fire. The dense canopy of the pine trees created a terrifying new dynamic known as the tree burst. When German mortar crews fired into the forest, they did not aim for the ground. The point-detonating fuses on the shells were highly sensitive. When the plunging shell struck the thick branches of the pine trees 50 or 60 feet in the air, it detonated instantly. The high explosive charge not only sprayed its own lethal iron fragmentation downward, but it also shattered the massive trees, transforming thousands of heavy, jagged wooden splinters into secondary projectiles raining straight down upon the American troops. The standard defensive posture, dropping to the ground or digging a shallow foxhole, offered absolutely no protection from a blast originating directly overhead. The tree burst negated all natural cover, turning the forest itself into a weapon. The casualty rates in the Hurtgen forest were catastrophic, largely driven by the inescapable vertical slaughter of the German mortar barrages. On the Eastern Front, the scale of warfare dwarfed anything seen in the West, and the mortar was deployed in unprecedented numbers. The Soviet Red Army, understanding the immense industrial requirements of tank production, heavily prioritized the manufacturing of extremely large caliber mortars. The Soviet 120mm heavy mortar was an absolute monster of a weapon, capable of firing a 35-pound high explosive shell over 3 miles. While the German panzer divisions relied on the speed and shock of their tanks, the Soviets utilized the brute force mathematics of massed and direct fire. They organized entire mortar brigades, grouping hundreds of these heavy tubes together to support infantry assaults. When a Soviet mortar brigade opened fire, they created a literal wall of high explosive destruction that pulverized German defensive lines. The logistics favored the Soviets immensely. A 120mm mortar could be manufactured in a fraction of the time and with a fraction of the steel required for a T-34 tank. The ammunition was cheap to produce and easy to transport on simple horse-drawn carts, allowing the Soviet army to maintain a staggering volume of fire even as their mechanized logistics struggled. The German infantry, fighting on the freezing steppes or in the ruins of cities like Stalingrad, learned to dread the heavy thud of the Soviet 120mm round, recognizing it as an instrument of industrial-scale slaughter that no trench could fully protect against. The Pacific theater presented a completely different set of logistical and environmental challenges, but the primacy of the mortar remained absolute. The American island hopping campaign involved amphibious assaults against heavily fortified coral atolls and volcanic islands covered in dense tropical jungle. The deployment of tanks on these islands was severely limited by the treacherous reefs, the soft beach sand, and the impassable jungle interior. The Japanese Imperial Army, deeply entrenched in caves and bunkers, understood they could not defeat the American forces in open combat. Instead, they relied heavily on their Type 89 grenade discharger, commonly and incorrectly referred to by the Americans as the knee mortar. This was a highly compact, lightweight weapon that a single Japanese soldier could carry and fire. While it lacked the range and payload of a standard mortar, its absolute ubiquity made it a terrifying weapon. The Japanese deployed them in massive numbers, hiding in the dense foliage or deep within the coral ridges, dropping explosive shells directly onto the American landing beaches and patrol routes. The plunging fire was perfectly suited to targeting Marines taking cover in the pulverized coral craters. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the American forces suffered horrendous casualties not from Japanese tanks, which were virtually non-existent, but from the relentless invisible rain of mortar and artillery fire directed from the subterranean fortresses. The environment of the Pacific entirely stripped away the mechanized advantages of the American military, forcing them into a brutal infantry war where the mortar dictated the pace of the advance. The vulnerability of the tank is often overlooked in popular history, but it is a critical factor in understanding why the mortar was a more consistent killer. A tank is a massive, high-value target. When a tank appears on the battlefield, it immediately draws the attention of every anti-tank gun, every artillery battery, and every strike aircraft in the vicinity. The life expectancy of a tank in heavy combat was terrifyingly short. They broke down, constantly shedding tracks, blowing engines, and sinking into the mud. They were blind, requiring the commander to expose his head from the hatch to see the battlefield, inviting sniper fire. In urban combat, tanks were extremely vulnerable to infantry hiding in the upper floors of buildings, dropping explosives onto the thin top armor. The mortar, however, is incredibly difficult to locate and destroy. A mortar squad could dig a deep pit behind a hill, set up the tube, fire 30 rounds in 2 minutes, and entirely disassemble the weapon and move to a new location before the enemy could trace the trajectory and call in counter battery fire. This tactic, known as shoot and scoot, made the mortar an elusive and persistent threat. It was a weapon system that thrived on concealment, allowing the crew to inflict massive casualties without ever exposing themselves to direct enemy fire. This survivability meant that mortars remained active and lethal long after the tanks had been destroyed or bogged down. The medical statistics gathered by the Allied clearing stations and field hospitals provide the ultimate, indisputable proof of the mortar's dominance. When military surgeons categorized the horrific wounds suffered by the infantry, they found that bullets from rifles and machine guns accounted for a surprisingly small percentage of the total casualties, usually hovering around 20%. The vast, overwhelming majority of combat injuries, often exceeding 70%, were classified as fragmentation wounds. These were caused by the jagged, tearing metal of high-explosive shells. While artillery and aerial bombs contributed significantly to this number, the frontline medical personnel consistently noted that the vast majority of fragmentation wounds during active infantry engagements were the direct result of mortar fire. The sheer volume of mortar shells dropped on the front lines, combined with their specialized fragmentation patterns and their ability to hit troops in defilade, created a grim mathematical certainty. The mortar was the primary engine of human destruction on the battlefield. It did not conquer territory like a tank, it did not secure the skies like a fighter plane, but its singular purpose, the efficient industrial slaughter of enemy infantry, was achieved with terrifying success. The reality of the Second World War was not the clean mechanized dash of the armored columns. It was the filthy, freezing, terrifying existence of the infantryman trapped in a hole in the ground, praying against the mathematical odds of survival. The tank was a symbol of national power, a massive piece of engineering that required the entire industrial base of a country to produce. But the mortar was the dark, intimate reality of the front line. It was a cheap, simple tube of steel that demanded no fuel and required minimal maintenance, yet it possessed the power to reach into the deepest trench and shatter the human body with unapologetic violence. The historical record, obscured by the romance of armor and aviation, is written in the blood of the millions of men who were torn apart by the unseen, plunging fire of the mortar. It stands as a profound testament to the grim efficiency of military engineering, a weapon that perfectly adapted to the unforgiving geometry of the battlefield and claimed its place as the undisputed apex predator of the Second World War infantry engagement.